Hi friends! Welcome to our Christmas in July continued. Today I'm showing you really quickly how simple it was for me to make these rainbow fish scale sequin cylinders. I don't know what we want to call them. They're cylinders, they have a sequins trim around it, and this happens to be a kind of rainbow fish scale sequin. I love it. I picked it up on clearance. You need some cylinders, whether you got them from the dollar store, Walmart, wherever. I happened to pick up the sequin trim from the clearance section in Hobby Lobby, but whatever trim you want to use, I'm sure will work. Just make sure you have enough of it to go around. I have a blade cutter or a rotary cutter on a mat and some removable glue dots, which I've never used before, but they worked out really well for this, especially the sequin fabric. If you have some sort of measuring tape, that would be helpful. And I used blue gel beads for this, but you can just use water and floating candles if you want. The gel beads just helped add the texture and the color that I wanted. So take your cylinder and you need to measure around the outside. And this is so we know how much trim or fabric or ribbon or whatever you're using. So we saw that this was 11 inches. I recommend doing a little bit extra because we need a little on the overlap, especially with the sequins. So I measured mine out on my cutting mat, and then I saw, okay, there's 11, so I just pushed it down just a smidge. Be very careful if you're using a rotary cutter. They're very sharp, but I found this to be the best way to get a nice straight line. And do this as many times as you need. I will say, measure all your cylinders. They're not all created equal, even if they look the same. They're usually pretty close. Now, I just did a quick spot test on mine to make sure we had a nice amount of coverage and a little bit of overlap. It's okay if it's not perfectly straight. The sequins are remarkably forgiving. So just make sure when you cut one, it fits. So when you were doing that test run, hopefully you can eye and either leave yourself a fingerprint or something where you want the top of your trim to be, and that's where you're going to place your first glue dot. Now these glue dots are in a container essentially that have sticky sides on both. They're sticky on both sides obviously, but there's removable pieces on both, so I like to do one, test it out, make sure the dot is in the right spot, and then place the next one. So that's why you see how we lined them up nice and easy to make sure they don't have to be perfectly straight. They just have to be mostly straight because you want to be able to support the piece. I'm sorry, I need to move the camera, but I couldn't or didn't. Either way, you know what I'm doing here. We're just sticking the sequins on. We pulled the other side of the glue dots off, and now we just wrap it around. And so while I use 2 dots on the first part, because the outer piece essentially is not only supporting that, but it's also kind of overlapping on the original portion, I ended up using 3 glue dots. So 2 essentially where they were before, and then I just put an extra third glue dot in the center. And that just helps make sure everything lays flat and is supportive. And I found that to be the best outcome without any bubbles or anything in my designs. In the fabric trim, let me rephrase that. In the fabric trim, it will lay flatter if you put some extra dots in. Now, I consider sequins fabric to be fairly heavy, but once these were secured on well, I only had one that came off, and I think it's because some of my fabric got sequins by accident, like sequin scraps in it, and it did lose some of its tackiness a little bit. But out of all the ones that I did, I've lifted up the sequins, replaced it, flattened it out many times, and they seem to be taking really well and holding up. So these glue dots actually do really, really well, even on the heavier sequin fabric. So what you're going to need to do most likely is probably play with how tight and snug you want your trim to be. I found it having a little bit looser helps keep it laying flat, but usually it just takes a few small adjustments and fine-tuning. Depending on what fabric you're using, it might be more obvious, but the sequins are very forgiving with all of the sparkliness of them, so don't fuss too much. Promise once it's all on the table, nobody's gonna notice. But one of the nice things about the sequins is the seam essentially disappears after you get it all laying flat, and like you can hardly tell it's there, which is really cool. So another reason for sequins. And then when you're done, fill the rest up with jelly beans if you're using them, or just water and a floating candle if you're going that route, and enjoy. They look gorgeous during the day, and at night when all the candles are illuminated, so pretty. I love them, and they look wonderful in my Christmas in July, merry and bright under the sea kind of stash busters, and I love it. And these add such a fun take on the table without being super fussy.